started here. Hundreds of high school kids in Kansas City were heartbroken after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the school district's failure to give them space to grieve. What started as a student protest grew in size and intensity to the point that it forever changed this community. Give me 30 minutes. Let me tell you a story. The who, what, when, where, but most of all, the why. It may make you proud, and it may make you cry. But my hope is that it reminds us all of how far we've come and inspires us to come together the rest of the way.
NBC interrupts its regular program schedule to bring you the following special report.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
I was in this room, it was 50 years ago, sitting somewhere near the north door, morning of the 9th of April, 1968.
Grace and Holy Trinity Church organized a special service honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. days after his assassination. There was a speaker.
A young lady walked up and handed him a note right here. He handed him a note. And he says, "Thank you. Is there a Mr. Alvin Brooks in the congregation?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You have an emergency call." It was Robert Wheeler, who was Assistant Superintendent of Urban Education for the Kansas School District. And he said, "Al, as we predicted last night, all hell's broken loose."
District officials met the night before to discuss closing KCPS schools for Dr. King's funeral. The 3 African Americans voted to close the schools. Everyone else said they should stay open. Ultimately, the superintendent, James Haslett, stepped in.
Haslett decided, the superintendent decided, well, here's what we'll do. They just completed the school at 42nd in Indiana. Let's name it Martin Luther King Jr. High School, and then fly all the flags on all the school properties half a mast. That wasn't good enough for us, but it was good enough for them, and so that's why the schools were open.
On April 9th, 1968, students from Lincoln Prep, Manual, and Central started calling each other.
I mean, King got shot, and it was like, what? They'd killed Martin Luther King? Here he was out there trying to do good, trying to do it peacefully, and for that to happen?
And Kansas City, Kansas had allowed its students to come out of school, and that troubled the kids in the Kansas City School District.
We're gonna walk out because the school is telling us to all stay in, and so we walked out.
The kids from Lincoln went first, then the students from Manual. Hundreds of them all went to Central, and when they got there, the group merged together and headed to City Hall.
It looked to me, they say 300, it looked like me 1,000 people coming to northbound of the Paseo, and they were like sidewalk to sidewalk.
And the 17th Terrace and Paseo is where the mayor came out and spoke to them.
Mayor Ilis Davis told the students they could go to City Hall.
I think the butterflies went to my stomach all the way up, oh, shoot,
So the kids went up north through the I-70 and then walked west on the eastbound lane.
Bruce R. Watkins leading the way, fist raised in the air.
I remember that march. My dad was serving as mayor pro tem, first African-American city councilman, now serving mayor pro tem during the riots. So I can see him feeling a personal responsibility, not only as a elected official, but as the person concerned.
Watkins was also the first African-American elected to county-wide office. 71 Highway is named after him. But on April 9th, 1968, he was grieving Martin Luther King's death too.
The most well-respected civil rights leader in this country, in the world, was just assassinated. The atmosphere, the mood of that time was still very on the edge.
It was already fuming. Even before his death, we were conscious of the fact that it was a separation of different colors.
1968 was also in the heart of the Black Power movement. African Americans were feeling newfound pride in their heritage. Everything from fashion to music to the raised fist became a symbol of solidarity and resistance in the face of discrimination. That symbol is still used today.
We were ensconced in that, and we were ready to fight on our end.
Bruce R. Watkins was too.
It's time for a change. It's time to march. It's time to do.
I felt like we were empowered to do something.
I was a city desk reporter at the Kansas City Star, and during that period of the march, there was no damage. The kids, no doubt, were angry, but they weren't causing any trouble. They were not breaking windows or anything like that.
The students made it to City Hall. At the same time, KMBC cameras recording as a police line was forming.
We all got in a semicircle, just a group of us. I mean, there was nobody there except a bunch of cops and highway patrolmen. And there was a black female walked into line in front of us, and she was cursing us and yelling at us. And all of a sudden, I saw a soft drink bottle from behind her come flying over her and broke. And next thing I heard was click, click, click. That's the sound of a pin being pulled with a gas grenade, and the gas, boom. And I mean, it was all over because, you know, we had the gas masks and stuff.
A whole bunch of tear gas went out in that crowd, and I think it made the crowd very, very mad. And I think the riot started at that moment.
And that afternoon, evening, the burning started.
It was hurt that brought the kids here to the steps of City Hall. But once the tear gas cans started flying, smoke filling the air, burning their eyes and their skin, the protesters moved from hurt to angry.
Personally, this is my own personal opinion, I didn't see a need for that first gas can. I mean, it was a pop bottle. It was one single soft drink bottle. It wasn't even close to the officers.
As an officer, what was your feeling? Did you feel like this is the right call, this is the wrong call? Oh no.
It's a term you can't use on TV. I'll just say, oh, sucks.
KMBC cameras were rolling as school district and city leaders brought in buses to get the kids away from City Hall and calm things down.
Call Father Timothy Given over at Holy Name Catholic Church at 23rd and Benton about opening the church for these kids, because that's where they had teen towns every weekend. The police followed them out there on these buses. The kids were in there, the music was blasting and everything, and then of course the police were there and they started taunting the police. And then police threw tear gas into the basement of the church.
Witnesses describe screams coming from below as officers blocked the doors. Others say police didn't even know the dance was going on.
Those young people had been completely honorable, peaceful, organized, and caring all the way from 7 o'clock in the morning. When the tear gas began to hit people and they felt like it was being done for nothing, for no reason at all, then there was this sense of, I gotta do something. Once that happened and people fanned back out into the community, then all of a sudden it began to turn into fires, and that the story of the riot began there.
At 3:21, the first shot is fired. At 4:17, the first Molotov cocktail is launched. By 5:20, Mayor Davis declared a state of emergency and imposed the first emergency curfew in Kansas City's history.
Is it pretty bad around?
It's pretty bad. It's bad everywhere.
As day turned to night, reports of looting, vandalism, and arson took over the airwaves. KMBC cameras were there as fire alarms sounded every 2 minutes.
As the night went on, it became scary, because then the tanks are going down our neighborhood. It was a curfew.
It's gunshots, ma'am. Just stay inside.
State troopers had already been called in.
I heard a voice come out of the creek and said, "Go back into the house." It was the National Guard. They were camped down in Brush Creek.
Rioters attacked numerous white people and targeted white-owned businesses too.
Race relations were shattered, and the city faced a real challenge.
This wasn't unique. Starting in 1964, there were riots all across the country. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit. There were almost 160 riots in the summer of 1967 alone. All of them stemmed from rising racial tension.
68, there was real anger.
These images from Ferguson in 2014 look very similar to the ones taken decades before. People in one community who seem miles apart.
We think of us against them sometimes, you know. And when I say them, I mean anybody who ain't the police is one of them, so to speak.
In the days that followed, 6 black men were killed during the rioting. Maynard Goh, Charles Martin, George McKinney Jr., Julius Hamilton, and Albert Miller. One with a case of whiskey in his hands, another with a hand in his pocket, 2 others just watching the fires, another following police orders.
None of them were armed. None of them had a confrontation with the police.
They were all shot by officers. No one ever charged in their deaths. Many in the black community feel scenarios like this are repeating themselves today.
The rumors were terrible. And there were people going around saying, oh man, them police going down and just shooting people on the street for no reason, just driving around shooting them, you know, and I knew that wasn't happening.
But there was violence.
Kids laying on the ground. I said, hey, Bubba, what happened to him? He saw he cut his head on the glass when he came out of the building, split the head open. Okay, I said, wait a minute. He was already outside when I left, okay. He pulled his gun out and he said he cut up in this piece of glass. And I knew what he meant. He decked him. As I looked back at it, I said, God, you know, we were worse than some of the people who we were trying to arrest, you know.
Today, police departments are grappling with the danger their officers face, working to protect those who protect us. At the same time, people are calling for fairness and enforcement when it comes to communities of color.
What do you think now, 2018, would help relationships between the police department and the community?
I'm from the old school. Communicating with the community. I'd like to think that the officers we're getting now and the policies and the way this department, you know, turns around, that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore.
It was an earth-shattering year, and the riots in Kansas City changed everything. 31st Street, which had a lot of African-American businesses, was essentially burned to the ground.
And the entire skyline of the city is lit up with flames. The worst seems to be from about 27th to 39th Street around Prospect, and every one of those blocks is a war zone.
I can recall being on my aunt's porch. She was at 32nd and Cleveland, just a block over from Mercington. And we stood on her porch in the dusk, and we could see the fires on 31st Street.
First responders who came to help became targets for the rioters. KMBC cameras caught the aftermath.
African Americans began to throw bottles and bricks at firefighters who came over to answer, the fire bill to put out the fires.
I was a junior in high school. I lived on Montgall Avenue, 44th and Montgall, 1 block east of Prospect. Some buildings and some things were being burned a block away from where we lived.
Did it make any impact on you?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I still remember it, and I still remember the feeling.
When you look at the looting and the arson and the vandalism, people had specific reasons for why they targeted some businesses and why they didn't hit other businesses.
And then people started putting signs on their windows, Soul Brother, to keep from getting burned down or looted or whatever.
Hundreds of businesses and buildings were destroyed. The property damage KMBC filmed would amount to almost $30 million today.
My mother kept telling us, why are we burning down our own things?
Well, because that's the only world they knew. To go west of truth was to die. And I think everybody realized that, if not consciously, certainly subconsciously.
Did we make a statement by getting out the rage? Yeah, but to burn down our own things didn't make any sense at that time.
So you see, again, from the perspective of somebody my age, those were not our things. Those were people who came into our neighborhood, did their business, and left at the end of the day.
Right.
So it didn't matter to us,
The 1968 Mayor's Commission report, released a few months later, identified why the rioting happened. It lists things like inequities in the educational system, a lack of adequate job opportunities, long-standing difficulties with the police department, and housing problems and frustration with efforts to fix it.
This was a political statement. This was using violence to communicate in a way that nonviolence had been used in the South. Now, was it a good idea? No, not really, but it was articulate.
44 people were hurt in the riots. The area around 31st and Prospect has never returned to the thriving business community it once was.
Yeah, 50 years ago, and it doesn't seem that long.
You get the sense that the riot could happen just a couple of months ago. All of those issues that caused the riot are still there.
This community was far more vibrant decades ago. The 1970 U.S. Census shows just over half of African-American headed households own their homes. But in the latest census in 2016, that number was down to just 37%. The number of African Americans in the city who are not in the workforce is up too, from 32% in 1970 to 36% in 2016. But unemployment overall has dropped from 12.6% in 1970 to 7.6% 2 years ago. Graduation rates paint an optimistic picture as well. At the college level, going from just 3% to 15%, and at the high school level, from 31% to 85%. Yet Kansas City public schools remain unaccredited. Finding quality, affordable housing is still a challenge, and the unemployment rate is still higher for African Americans than it is for white Kansas Cityans. What lessons can we learn from these riots 50 years ago? Why does it matter today?
The lessons that can be learned is that when you have disaffected people and you do not address their concerns over a period of time in a way that's constructive, you are going to have more riots. It's just that simple. When you have situations where people feel that they have no recourse and no hope, they'll take to the streets and start burning stuff up.
Once again, young people are taking the lead on a movement to enact change. On March 24th, thousands gathered at Tice Park for the March for Our Lives protest, pushing for gun reform. The local rally, organized in part by some of these Lincoln College prep seniors who staged a walkout of their own on March 14th. We wanted to know how they feel about their fellow alum walking out 50 years ago.
Impressed but not surprised.
Exactly. I feel like it's a Lincoln trait that we have. That's wild. Yeah, I feel like we could do that, but like knowing that they did that without any cell phones and like they organized that themselves, that's wild to me. That makes me really proud. Yeah, proud. Like knowing that these kids were our age and they're doing big things like that. And it started at our school. Yeah.
The major change that always happens is when a new generation with different ideals or different beliefs on what should be done comes in and creates change.
We're always thinking about stuff like that.
Every issue that America has, the youth should have some type of input on it because we are the ones who will see the consequences and the repercussions, whether good or bad.
This was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Why is it important? Why are we even talking about this now? It's ancient history.
Because America has never dealt with the issue of race in America.
We're in a climate today that I think is much worse than we were 50 years ago.
You know, racism has kind of grown up. Put a suit and tie on.
We have a serious problem in that people believe that it's all over, and that inhibits us from making it better.
How do we make it better?
Well, we make it better by people recognizing, first of all, that this is not nirvana, that we have not reached perfection on the issue of race.
In many ways, we are still divided.
Mostly white Americans see the 60s as a time of decline for the United States, when we lost our way, when people became disrespectful of law and order and lost a certain amount of patriotism. But by and large, African Americans see the 60s as a very redemptive time.
Black people, in fact, had been amazingly patient. How they kept it under control in that era is hard to figure out.
In the 5 decades since the 1968 riot, some things have changed dramatically.
People in Kansas City really ought to feel pretty good about things they've done. We had a fire chief, a police chief, we had black superintendents, we've had a black chair of the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, and it goes on and on and on.
Recent protests in Kansas City have all stayed peaceful.
Fortunately, we've got a police department that's been pretty good about protests and how they've responded.
But in other areas, there's still room to improve.
Some of the same issues that we faced in 1968 that were the crux of the rioting around this nation, to a degree, still exist in urban America today.
We got to think about economic development. We have to think about education, and we have to think about housing.
But I also think that on the governmental level, we have to enact policies and recognize that there are differences and that some things have been done in order to perpetuate a bad system, and we have to create policies that address those issues.
Then, lean in to people who are different than you.
Just because we're black doesn't mean that we know everything about the tensions between black and white. We have to be willing to learn.
50 years later, do you look back at 1968 and say that it was worth it?
Oh, sure, it was worth it.
Oh, heck yeah. It was worth it, and it wasn't worth it, because again, to this day, that has not come back.
I don't advocate riots and confrontation, but it does raise the consciousness.
KMBC cameras caught the aftermath.
I think it succeeded in that. I mean, there was a certain renewed commitment to these problems that obviously shaped a lot of people's lives.
If you knew in 1968 what you know now about that riot, when they called you out of this church, what would you have told those kids?
Let's go to City Hall.
What started as a story about a student protest became the story of Kansas City and really our nation. One group blind to the needs of another, and chaos because of it. 50 years later, we're having the same debates and the same problems in our communities. It's been over 18,000 days since April 9th, 1968. Let's not waste one more, allowing our differences to divide us. I'm Dia Wall. Thanks to Kansas City Public Television for collaborating with us on this project, as well as the UMKC LaBuddy Collection and the Kansas City Public Library. And thank you for watching 68, the Kansas City race riots then and now.